Hi, everybody.
Hi.
How do you do?
Do you mind getting the door, please?
Thank you all so much for being here at our immigration forum. I really appreciate you all. We have kind of a pretty packed 2 hours. We're gonna go over some just like general, actually let me just introduce myself. I am Representative Karis Duncan. I am from Window 6. I represent Wilmington, Weddingham, and Halifax. And to my right.
Hi, I'm Representative Leonora Dodge from Essex, Chittenden 23, which is Essex Town and City of Essex Junction. And I can just give a little bit of maybe the genesis of this panel. There's a small subgroup of legislators that are trying to focus on the effects and impacts of whatever is happening federally with our, and how that intersects with our roles as state legislators, and what are the limitations, but then also what are the open avenues. And so one of the big areas that bubbled up in our initial meeting, aside from sort of funding cuts, which is, as we know, a big deal, we immediately thought about immigration. And what we also realized is that our Ledge Council, as amazing as they are, we don't count on anybody with immigration expertise, and that issue intersects a lot of the issues that our various committees work on. And so we thought, what better thing than to bring legal experts to come and speak to us. I'm sure that a lot of you, like I, have gotten questions from constituents, whether they are employers or immigrants themselves, about what can I do. We all see what's been going on in the news, and Jubilee is going to help us make sure that this gets recorded. Thank you. And so, aside from just the basic facts of what's happening at the federal level, we wanted to really have their expert opinion to come and help us help our communities and be of service, and that not just the bill writing, but our role as people that connect our constituents to the services and agencies that are at their disposal. So with that, I will let Emily continue.
Thank you, Leonora. I really appreciate that. So I'll just kind of take you really quick through our agenda. We're going to do some intros and some table setting with terms so we can understand kind of some of the varying components of this issue. And then we are going to move into a federal update and kind of understand what the federal actions have been and what their effects are on immigrants, on legal professionals, on advocates and service providers, on private businesses and public entities like schools and universities. And we'll probably deal with a couple of questions at that point. And then third, we're going to talk about legislative support. What kind of know your rights information do we need to know? How can we best help our constituents? And what kind of bills, and if there are bills circulating, what's being worked on, so we can be fully aware of that. Yes, and like I said earlier, just to point out, we do have a resource table with plenty of information, and I'm sure some folks around here will definitely share more. So just to introduce our panel, at the far end, we have Dave Saloni, who's the VP of Alumni Relations and Development at the Vermont Law and Graduate School. Next to him is Jill Martin-Diaz. They are the Executive Director of the Vermont Asylum Assistance Project, right? Okay. And then we have Brett Stokes, who's an assistant professor at the Vermont Law and Graduate School, and also the director of the Center
for Justice
for Justice Reform, the Center for Justice Reform Clinic. Got it. And then we have Leslie Holman, immigration lawyer. Great, thank you all so much for being here. And I am gonna just pass this down if you all have, so first I'm gonna start with you, Leslie. Actually no, we're gonna start with Jill, because I think we need to kind of set some actual term groundwork. So
Recording in progress.
Thank you, Jubilee. You're the best. Okay.
I'm just gonna have the meeting ready, and I'm gonna take her out where she'll be happier, but, yes.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Julie. Okay, so Jill, can you help us understand what the difference is between an asylum seeker and a refugee? Okay, in here, if you hold down the power button, it should.
Testing.
Here, I can pass this down.
Testing.
Oh, good. What do we got? Okay.
Hi, everyone. The difference between an asylum seeker and a refugee. So the difference is status. Immigration status can be summarized as the right to have rights. Immigration law is separated into two structures. One is about gaining status, gaining the right to have rights. The other is about losing status, losing the right to have rights. And seeking asylum is one of the many ways available to gain the right to have rights. When a person is outside of the United States and they've gone to a United Nations coordination point to seek asylum and then be resettled in a country where they want to live, resettle long-term, that person will be arriving in their new country, maybe the United States, as a refugee. They've already been processed and found to meet the definition, and as a result, have the right to have all of the rights associated with refugee status. When a person is inside the United States and they have not yet been put through a legal process, and they declare themselves an asylum seeker, and they tell the US government, make a finding that I am a refugee, that person is seeking asylum. And US immigration law will call the status that they earn at the end of a long proceeding asylum status. At the end, whether you're an asylee or a refugee, it's functionally the same. It's the right to have the same suite of rights that we make available to people who seek humanitarian protection. The biggest challenge is, for many years now, the asylum seeking system in the United States has been so backlogged, so jammed up, that there are very few cases getting adjudicated relevant to how many are pending. And when a person is just in the posture of seeking asylum, they are not a refugee, they are not an asylee, and they don't have the right to have rights. And the vast majority of the vulnerable people in our community are in that posture. They're asylum seekers, and they've been waiting sometimes for 10 years. I thought that the clinic client from the southern Vermont who filed in 2016 was the longest pending asylum seeker. I just met someone who filed for asylum in 2014 and has not heard a decision because of how backlogged the case is. So there's a huge proportion of our non-citizen foreign-born community here who are in this limbo. They are not at risk of being deported, but the law says that ICE is allowed to detain them if they want to during the pendency of their proceedings. The law also says that state agencies and federal agencies can discriminate about whether or not they're eligible for benefits, like healthcare and cash assistance and food programs on the basis of their lack of status. And these are folks who are survivors of trauma. They experienced the trauma that prompted their flight from their countries of origin. They experienced trauma in their journey to the United States. And many of them tell me that sometimes the hardest trauma of all is living in this legal limbo in the United States, especially in a place like Vermont, where for people who come from countries that are nothing like Vermont, I've had a lot of clients tell me, it's cold and lonely and not sunny, and food is weird, and I miss home, but I can't go back. And there is just this legal fiction standing in between that person's ability to fully and safely participate in our society or be stuck living in the shadows.
Thank you so much. Um,
Can they
Thank-
work?
Thank you for
Can
that.
they work? Can they get a work permit?
Are they able to get a work permit?
Thanks for the question. So a person who has an application pending can apply for permission to work. Work permission is not a standalone immigration benefit. It's not something that you can apply for on its own. You need to be seeking some other immigration pathway, and then while that's pending, you can ask for permission to work. Or once your pathway is granted, it might come with permission to work. There is a 5-month waiting period from the time when you apply for asylum and when you can actually apply for a work permit based on that asylum. The government then takes a mystery amount of time from weeks to months to actually produce the work authorization document. And with that, the person can get their social. And that's a long time to spend without income. In my 10 years of practice, I have never, ever once encountered an asylum seeker who is not working. It is necessary to meet your daily needs, to have shelter and food, and provide for your children. And a lot of really key economies here in Vermont, agriculture, hospitality, construction lately, really depend on underdocumented labor. And it's a very much a part and parcel of our economic system in the United States and has been since the country's founding and since immigration laws were created. And one really important fact I share with potential clients or current clients is that unauthorized work does not prejudice your asylum claim. It does not factor into the analysis of whether or not you win asylum. And in fact, the removal defense legal work that Brett and I are involved in nowadays, because we're having to shift focus away from asylum seeking and now focus more on detained defense, having a history of consistent work in the United States with or without authorization can weigh favorably on your removal defense legal claims.
Does anybody else have any other questions before we? Yes, Angela.
This feels like a really basic question, and I'm sort of, I'm sad to say I don't know this, but where is the MAP clause? Where in our, is it, where are the cases, the asylum cases heard? Is it regional? What determines where the scope?
We wanted to just finish with the definition of terms before we launch into the whole rest of the.
Okay, so, sorry, we're gonna redirect a little bit. We're gonna hold questions, we'll go back through the terms, and then we'll come back and dive deeper. So we'll add an added layer, that's enrollment. Would you be able to tell us about the differences between temporary protected status, a sort of generalized immigrant or non-immigrant visas, and then DACA?
Alphabet soup. When we talk immigration, we often, because all the visas have letters, and so we talk about alphabet soup. I'll talk a little quickly on temporary protected status because it's similar to what Jill's been talking about. So temporary protected status is something we've decided and said, you know, it is not safe for you to go home to Haiti, which is cholera-ridden, and other countries. So we say, look, you're here. We're going to allow you to stay here a while because we know that you can't go back. And similarly, there's also something called humanitarian parole. Right now, people are getting them confused because we've got people switching from one to the other. A lot of these programs have been stopped and started again, and right now we're on a roller coaster. But again, there are people that are coming from countries that they can't return to, and so you have that need. And you'll compare that to your immigrant visas and your non-immigrants, and that's for which we have the alphabet soup. And here in Vermont, you know, we have asylees, we have refugees, we have TPS holders, we have humanitarian parole holders that are impacted by this. But so many of our other people are impacted by this because we've got students. They're not you know, residents. We've got family members coming across the border. I can tell you stories that with this increased scrutiny, as it is, if you have a spouse in Canada, you may live 50 miles apart. And if you want to do it the, quote, right way, and that's really a way because our Congress has not passed has not been able to agree on immigration in so long, it means you're going to wait 2 years, 2.5 years for your spouse to get here. So that is another population, even though they're not it's not a particular visa or a status, but there are visitors, there are business visitors, there are visitors for pleasure that are also part of this population that are impacted. We've got our DACA kids. We all have heard of DACA. DACA was the program put forth by President Obama that essentially gave didn't give a pathway, it gave limbo, because of these kids are still living in limbo. They weren't born here, but they've lived here. The U.S. is home. They came over while they were under 16 years old. They haven't committed a crime. Through no fault of their own. They're graduated high school, and they're still waiting. And yes, they can get work authorization, but that's it. And every 2 years they got to reapply, and they don't know what's going to happen, and they're living with an invisible anvil over their head. And now, again, we'll talk later about what's happening with them. Can they talk? Can they speak? How long will they be able to stay? We also have employees. We've got so many businesses here in Vermont, and it's been so wonderful to see how our businesses have embraced our asylees and our refugees, and they're the ones that are going to work, and they're the ones that are taking the jobs that other people don't want to fill. But we also have we have businesses here that hire people just for engineering or things like that, or I represent entertainers and musicians and all of these kinds of people that are also experiencing difficulty, and they're in Vermont, but they're impacted by all of this as well. And we'll talk about that why as we go on. So, when you say non-immigrant, again, I don't want to have this, but you remember that there's people that includes visitors and non-visitors and people that are just coming that don't have a quote status, but have a right to be here, or a privilege, I guess we should say.
Well, that gets us to our next term. So what we have been talking about for both of these sections are people that have some kind of documented status. They've had a check-in with an authority figure and are in the system and moving along somewhere. So Brett, would you be able to talk to us about undocumented immigrants?
Yes.
Or
well,
also under
well, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Nice. Undocumented immigrants are basically everybody who wouldn't neatly fall into one of these alphabet soup categories, or asylee, or refugee. It's basically what you could describe it's a way you could describe someone while they're even somebody who's waiting in process to get one of these visas or to get asylum status would technically be undocumented. So really all that does is denote the lack of status. We've kind of been dancing around this in what Jill's been saying and Leslie's been saying. So really, when you're in the process of waiting for one of those visas, you would be technically considered undocumented. And when you're undocumented, it's just like it sounds. You don't have the same legal benefits and rights to access employment, to access housing, those sorts of things. There are certain states, like in Vermont, where there are maybe more opportunities, such as access to driving privileges, but not every state's like that. And on top of that, there are certainly limits to, what an undocumented person has access to. Sure, there might be certain things that are opened up once they may be under one of those categories where they have access to work authorization, but those are relatively few and far between. Somebody who hasn't applied for asylum but is living in the United States undocumented, maybe even someone who's lived here for 10, 15, 20 years undocumented, they're not eligible for a work permit just by virtue of them having lived here for a really long time. You have to be going through some sort of process in order to have access to that. So really, when we're talking about what an undocumented immigrant is, it's kind of the best way to describe it is somebody who is here and intends to, remain in the United States, but they might not enjoy the same status and rights as someone who is, going through one of these processes.
And I would say, and a perfect example would be someone married to a U.S. citizen. They've been here for a long time. They're married to a U.S. citizen, and it used to be called a terrible immigration also speaks in acronyms, and the acronym is POSIBAG, which is terrible, right? But it means a period of stay authorized by the Attorney General.
Oh.
But what does that POSIBAG? But it might not exist any longer. So.
Thank you, Brett, and that's a good for that. And so, with all of this conversations, we're talking about a whole group of people that really help bolster our economy while they're waiting for this status. David, would you be able to tell us more about what the economic impact is on Vermont?
I'll do my best.
Okay.
As the non-immigration lawyer on the panel here. We've already, I think, alluded to several of sort of the micro economies that immigrants essentially serve and create in the state of Vermont. And they may include food service, they may include construction, they may include farm workers. It's a growing economy. So these smaller economies are on the rise, and they're very important to the state. Now, my thoughts on the economic benefits of immigrants really leans more into the economic benefits of the civil legal services that some of the nonprofit organizations like the Center for Justice Reform Clinic that Brett directs, how that actually benefits Vermont and Vermonters. And so I've done sort of my deep dive into this Vermont Bar Foundation study that happened a few years back. And it developed a bunch of algorithms that came up with a formula that for every $1 of civil legal services, free civil legal services, so this is pro bono legal services delivered to immigrants and other underserved populations, but here we're talking about immigrants, so I'll focus on that, yields an $11 economic benefit to the state of Vermont and its residents. And so, those are suddenly, when you start multiplying things by, 1 to 11 factor, the numbers get very large. And so our Center for Justice Reform Clinic, as an example, has a budget that's about $171,000, so that delivers an economic benefit, when you do the math, of about $1.8 million to the state and its residents each year. And I won't go into great detail in terms of what those benefits are, but I will say that access to civil legal services is critical for immigrants who don't know what this legal system is all about when they get here. And it's either self-represent or not even think about getting into court to get some of the services that they deserve. Or they can turn to some of the organizations that actually provide civil legal services for them for free. And so one of the nice things that happens with the Center for Justice Reform Clinic is we've got people like Brett and other faculty members, but in particular it's the student workforce that's very powerful, because from our perspective as an educational institution, they come for free. In fact, they pay us, right, to help immigrants and help other underrepresented folks in the state of Vermont. And that's a huge benefit to the state and to immigrants and to their children and their families. So we're grateful to the students who are doing this work they're learning, and then oftentimes they stay. And then they start to work as attorneys either in private practice or in nonprofits, and they continue to help people on a pro bono basis because they've become habituated. They understand the importance of it, and that serves the state well. So I think I'll stop there. There are a couple of brochures that I put on the table that show a little bit more detail on this. I think that's all.
Yeah,
Thank you
so much. Jill,
Yeah, I appreciate that, Dave. And I've done a deep dive also, like in this session, we've been involved in a few State House efforts to try and shore up our protections, our infrastructure for foreign-born people in Vermont. And so I do have some numbers about like a snapshot of what are we talking about here when we talk about who the population is and what the economic impacts are of just their existence, right? Because I'm a humanitarian advocate, right? Like I was called to the mission of the work because of the way it moved me, my own experiences in my family, like many of us. And then, but it turns out, it's, you know, I was interested, especially in such a divisive political moment, to learn more about the economic argument for immigration. And fortunately for me, when I looked into the economic issues, it turns out that it also makes good dollars and cents. So Vermont has about 30,000 foreign-born people. Foreign-born people would include folks who are maybe now citizens, right? So it's a broad swath, but many folks who have citizenship are still living in mixed status families. So, and the law technically says, not to plant ideas into the ether, naturalization citizenship is something that can be taken away in federal district court. The law does allow for it, so, but not that that's gonna happen. Don't worry. You heard it here first, it's not. But I think that, you know, we really need to look big picture at the foreign-born population regardless of immigration status and say, okay, this is the population that we need to be looking at and concerned about. The American Immigration Council did some really interesting data work, and they mapped this project with some visual aids called Map the Impact. And you can go and take a look at the map of the impact of immigrant taxpayers and spending power and entrepreneurs here on the Vermont economy. And here are some numbers that I learned from that. Immigrants contribute about $230 million toward federal and state taxes here in Vermont. They account for $620 million in spending power. They are the fastest growing working age demographic in our state, and as we know, our aging population is fueling our dual workforce shortage and unaffordable housing crises. So they're the fastest growing population of working age families who are coming and filling jobs and enrolling in school. They are also 80% more likely to fill a job in a sector with a workforce shortage. Leslie alluded to that. They're also 80% more likely to start a business, which is very interesting. I was talking with some of the colleagues on the Treasurer's Federal Transition Task Force, and one of the barriers they came up against in the Central Vermont Recovery effort was that many business owners on Main Street in Barrie and Montpelier are foreign-born business-owned businesses. And because of people's immigration situations, they were not eligible for federal FEMA relief. And so all of these Save the Main Street efforts were actually very deeply tied to our challenge of helping Vermonters get regularized immigration status. So I'll stop there, but I just wanted to kind of put in the room that I am now a converted humanitarian, and I now bring a more informed, expansive approach to why I believe that immigration is good for Vermont.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. That was really wonderful. Those numbers are very helpful to put into context. So now I actually want to jump back to Angela's question. You were asking about when it comes to asylum seekers, where are they processed? Is that what you're asking?
And well, where are their cases heard?
Where are their
I'm
cases
trying to
heard?
understand where the backlog is, and understanding, is it like regional, the way that like district courts work and stuff like that?
A judiciary question.
A judiciary question.
Do you want to?
I mean,
I'm sick of my voice.
I'm sure we could all speak to that.
Yeah,
It depends. But if somebody is seeking, so we're talking specifically about asylum seekers right now. if somebody is seeking asylum affirmatively, so they're not in any sort of immigration proceeding right now, they're not in immigration court, they would be processed or their case would be heard by what's called the Newark Asylum Office. There are 10, 13, 15 asylum offices.
I didn't know what you're talking about. I was like, asylum seekers? Way more, buddy.
Yeah, way more. I don't know how many asylum offices there are, but there
Not
are.
enough.
But there are fewer than there are states, and the one that serves Vermont is the Newark Asylum Office. So when an affirmative asylum case, which is really when we're talking about the backlog, we're talking about affirmative asylum seekers typically, and those cases are heard in Vermont by the Newark Asylum Office when they go on what are called circuit rides. So without some sort of special dispensation, you can't just like go to Newark and have your case heard. They have to come up here to us to have their cases heard. And so whenever they do that, the few times a year that they actually do it, only a handful of cases are heard each time. So it's a really efficient system. The other cases are, so for the folks that are, fighting their cases against charges of inadmissibility or deportability in immigration court, those cases, if you're residing in Vermont, are heard by the Chelmsford Immigration Court. So anybody who's in any sort of immigration court proceeding would be, the jurisdiction would be in front of the Chelmsford Immigration Court, which is in, I think, it's near Boston.
Yeah, it's in the Chelmsford, somewhere around Boston.
Somewhere over there.
But just to help, because it's hard to understand. So when he talks about affirmative asylum, so someone is here, you have to make a claim for asylum within a year of your arrival. So if that, you've made a decision to do that. Other times, if you're seeking entry, you can have what's called a credible fear hearing, right? You're coming into the United States and you tell them, the reason I'm at your border is I'm in trouble, I'm afraid. When that happens, they get put in deportation proceedings. So that's where the difference is. So a lot of those people are in deportation and end up in a different court system. And we don't have enough judges, we don't have, the circuit, I remember years ago, it'd be years before the circuit would come back to Vermont. And, these guys would be waiting for forever. So it depends on also to some extent how they got here as to where they are in which type of assignment. It's still an asylum proceeding, but they end up in different places. Does that help at all?
Yeah, it does. It certainly sounds a little, I don't want to say haphazard, but it sounds like a total crapshoot. Like you can't predict when there will be an opportunity to have your case heard, and it sounds like it's regional, and so folks in Vermont might be on a list including all asylum seekers in New York City, and so New York State, New Jersey, like all these what my uninformed brain would see as hubs, and we're just like everyone's in a big old list.
Yeah. Yeah, it does seem it's working.
I'll offer, yes, you just described it perfectly. And zooming out, let's say that we're building toward, a movement for immigration reform at the midterm. Structurally, the immigration system is very heavily funded by congressional appropriations. Through our immigration law enforcement system, we fund the largest civil law enforcement branch in the world. That's immigration, customs enforcement, homeland security investigations, customs and border protection, etc. All of those officers with guns. And so we give a lot of appropriations to that. What we don't appropriate at all is USCIS, the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, the benefits granting branch of the department. So anytime you apply for, a work permit of any kind, the agency is self-run off of fees, filing fees, which are exorbitant. And they're so exorbitant and they're still not high enough to actually provide for meaningful processing of the demand. And then you also have this issue where the Congress has not kept up with funding immigration courts at the rate that it's been funding prosecution and enforcement. So as immigration customs enforcement funding goes up and up and up, they're looking for and putting more people into removal proceedings in immigration court. The courts are just jammed. So there's millions and millions of cases pending before the immigration courts. And right now, the Trump administration is putting more and more and more cases into the system. And so that's another place where things are gonna get worse in terms of backlog.
Yeah. Let's hang on questions. I want to take a little temp check because this is a lot of information. So I wanted to see where people wanted to go. Do you want to learn more about the federal impacts, or should we talk about safety, prevention, and know your rights? Safety, prevention, and know your rights. Okay, so we'll do that, and then we'll jump back to all of these other consequential issues. Jonathan, did your question fit into that? The know your rights stuff? All right, so on the safety, prevention, and know your rights, I guess I'm gonna just open this up for anybody, but what kind of precautions need to be taken at home, at school, at work, or while traveling that we should be mindful of?
I know it's scary to take the microphone on this one, and there's things we should be cautious of. But yesterday I had consults with clients, and I said, I'm going to say things to you that I have. I'm 63 years old. When I started practicing immigration, people had no idea what it was. They'd say, oh, I'm a nanny, or something like that. What do we take precautions for? Well, now we take precautions for what are you talking about? To some extent, that is something I'm actually asking people, and this is, of course, that comes down the road. I mean, if you want to talk immediate precautions, one of the things now is that they're really heavily focused on any kind of infraction, right, that's going to lead to a violation. So in the past, and people don't know this, but as an immigrant or non-citizen, you are required to have proof of your status on you at all times. And I used to say to my clients, well, I'm so tired of getting the washed passports and the green card that's been through the dryer and just carry copies on it. I am advising people to have proof of their status on them. I don't know if you guys are doing the same. I'm advising them to have original documentation on them. I'm doing this for my new citizens as well, even though they are citizens, so that they can prove it if they need to. I'm not talking about know your rights, I'm just talking about generally as a whole. You can start to talk about, and I'll let you guys talk about warrants and judicial warrants. There's different types of warrants, right? Because we hear about people coming in and can they come in? There's administrative warrants and there's judicial warrants. One signed by the court, by the judge, that cannot be ignored. An administrative warrant, not that it's ignored, but you can decline. And right, you can politely decline to some extent. Most people might not know that, and they're afraid to do that as well. But there are, so whether or not someone can just come in, I could talk about what's going on. I'm not a border czar, but I do a lot at our borders, and we are a border state. And the right, within 100 miles of this border is considered the border. That allows for search and seizure. That allows, when you go to the border, even as a U.S. citizen, for them to look at your phone, your laptops. You have more protections as a citizen, somewhat, and there's, in 2018, your phone is a conduit to the world. So to what level can they do that? But as there's things to talk about if you think that you might be searched, or if you're crossing a border. I could talk on this forever, but I'll give you guys a chance to. For others, if you want, or I can keep droning on about the protection.
There's a lot of precautions, but that either and it'll depend the precautions that one person should take. A, it might not work for them, and B, the precautions that I might suggest, or Leslie might suggest, or Jill might suggest, is gonna vary based on status. So for example, carrying proof of legal status with you. I talked earlier about undocumented immigrants. More often than not, they don't have status. And so they can't really carry around the same, proof that they have status. In this day and age, one of the things that I have been recommending my clients do is bring with them at least, a copy of some typically if they're my client, they've got some sort of application pending, or they have a next court date, those sorts of things. I ask them to carry with them proof of those things.
And so I'm gonna just jump in really bit.
Yeah.
When you ask them to carry these things, are you asking for hard copies or digital copies, okay?
I mean, typically, digital's fine, but if I can give them, hand them a copy of it, when they're in my office with me, that's what I do. Just fold it up, put it in your wallet, call it a day. But is that gonna be enough if you come into contact with CBP or ICE? Who's to say? It might depend on what their mood is that day. So, the case in point, I have an anecdote of a client who found himself at or near the Canadian border with proof of all of these things and was still detained for a month and a half before I could get him out on bail. So these are things that will protect you and be a good precaution, but it's not a make or break. And I certainly think as well, there are a number of different precautions that I would even advise even my most documented clients, like permanent residents and those sorts of things, typically if I'm working with a permanent resident, they probably have some form of criminal history. And so I'm advising them of this, that, or the other, and in particular, if they're traveling, even though I can likely point to, here's why you're, not inadmissible or deportable as a result of this criminal conviction, I'm still making sure that they're leaving the country, if they need to, with a letter from me that basically explains all of this. So there's a lot of, it's tough to say where do you stop with the precautions? I don't know, but there's a lot that you should take.
Can I ask you to speak about the kind of the two phone numbers that we as legislators might be apt to want to share with folks who are either trying to get some of the legal help or who are suddenly in detention, but also the service that Vermont Legal Aid was helping with for people who have children or property in Vermont that if they fear deportation, what can they do?
I'll say as a transition sentence, I think the takeaway from this question of whether you take precautions or not, there's lots of different ways to talk about constitutional rights and who has them and whose burden it is to keep them alive. When we talk about showing your immigration papers to an officer, we're talking about waiving your right to silence. And the point that Brett's making is there are a lot of people for whom the immigration law does not ever give them an opportunity to make it safe to waive their rights. So I actually, I train on Fourth Amendment and immigration preparedness a lot. I'm going to Bennington tomorrow to train at a town hall down there. And we start with the Fourth Amendment rights, the constitutional rights of how everyone, regardless of status, has this floor baseline right about how to interact with law enforcement. And we don't get to control how law enforcement reacts, right? We don't get to control what they do after we assert our rights. And so I let people know that they have the right also to waive their right to silence and to show their immigration papers and say, please don't detain me, I'm not one of the ones that you want. But as Brett says, there's human error, assuming best intentions, there's human error. And so something I'm trying to do also is just normalize what immigration detention is. How many more people are likely to experience it now? And how you can conduct yourself in a detained setting so that you know how to not be fooled into signing away your rights, so that you can hold on until Brett can bail you out and bring you back home so you can work on your case from your community. And so when I'm thinking about all of that, I think that's what I have in mind when I talk about, like, here are some phone numbers that you all need. Because there's a difference between legal and felt emergency. I want to validate that immigration detention is literal prison, it's terrible, and you have not been accused of nor committed a crime. Being undocumented or removable is not a criminal offense, and yet you get shackled and jumpsuited and thrown in with Gen Pop, and that's, even if you have already served your time and made society whole, that's how the immigration law has been written for decades. And when a person is being taken away, it feels like, oh, we need a lawyer right this second. But there's nothing that I can do with my body to stop Immigration and Customs Enforcement from effectuating an arrest, putting someone in detention. Right? I was at a training this week and I heard this phrase that I liked. Don't concede, but don't impede. You don't have to give away your facts if you don't want to. You can stay silent. And don't impede. If the officer is arresting you, like, no one should use their body to stop the arrest, right? There are some community responses that can be really effective at the moment of an arrest. ICE says, we have someone we think is removable under the immigration law, and we're going to exercise discretion to detain them. There's a rapid response phone number. Right now, the leading rapid response coordinator in Vermont is Migrant Justice. They have been providing technical assistance to other community-based organizations that want to set up localized rapid response in their communities, and I heard of one getting stood up in Brattleboro. And the Migrant Justice Rapid Response number is a number to call when there is, like, ICE stuff going down right now, and then there's going to be community-based interventions that are needed, because who's going to pick up that person's kid from school? That person has asthma and they didn't have their inhaler on them. How are we going to track where this person gets detained so that we can keep an eye on them, so that we can connect them with legal counsel? That's a community type of intervention, and that's what we mean when we say rapid response. We also, in rapid response, want to document what happened. You want to be a good witness in the event of seeing an ICE arrest happen, because a lot of ICE arrests happen in illegal ways, and if we can document those facts, document the witnesses who saw the illegal ways, then we might have some additional claims and defenses available to protect the immigrant in their immigration proceedings down the pike, right? Then, after the rapid responders, once the person is detained and stabilized, that's when they call lawyers, right? The rapid responders know to call us and to get us involved. So both of our organizations just signed on to co-counsel some of the recent detentions that have been getting media attention. We've, the rapid responders kind of stabilize the family with community response and then get the detention removal defenders involved, right? And then the second phone number that Representative Dodge was referencing, what about everyone else? What about a person with parole who saw the news that parole is ending? Or the 2 Nicaraguan students at Champlain Valley Union who got a notice saying that they need to self-deport from USCIS. All of those, those are real felt emergencies, but from an immigration lawyer's perspective, those are very routine types of matters, and there is no statewide intake for that number. There hasn't been historically, but we're working in coalition to set one up. And so we are in negotiations with Legal Services Vermont. They're the partner organization to Vermont Legal Aid. They run the civil intake hotline for every type of legal matter, historically besides immigration. And we're working with them now to make sure that they have the resources that are needed to engage with our populations, their language access needs, et cetera, to be able to start receiving and fielding calls for routine immigration legal assistance. So I'm like afraid to blow up everyone's phones by sharing those numbers right now, but is that what you would like me to do, Representative Dodge?
Are any of the handouts, do any of them include?
I will make sure.
Why don't we do this? If you're interested in the number, come and get it, or email.
Yeah, and our website, theaapbt.org, it looks like this. It's awesome. DVM social work students help me curate it, and it has all the latest info about all the things. So referral information can be found there.
Thank you so much. And so just to kind of recap, because that was like wonderful information. Should we have a constituent that gets into a situation and it really is imminent, Migrant Justice is kind of our statewide coordinator of rapid response at the moment. Also, look in your areas and see if there are anybody if there are any organizations that are linked up with Migrant Justice, and get their numbers and their contacts too if they are in your area. And also document, or if you're kind of running interference from here, see if you can get somebody on the ground to document the situation and make sure that we have as much information as possible. Is there anything else that we should be mindful of?
Migrant Justice has made the phone number public, so here you go, y'all. The number to call, if it is an actual legal emergency, meaning this is how Migrant Justice defines it, active border patrol checkpoint being set up on a highway, right? They're doing a checkpoint and just checking people's situation. A roadside stop by a DHS vehicle, or ICE agents that are currently in a home. Those are examples of emergencies. Please call Migrant Justice at 802-881-7229. That's 802-881-7229. If it is not an active emergency, but it happened in the past, that's when you should report the activity to my organization. And all of this is summarized on a very beautiful Instagram post that Migrant Justice made and tagged me in. ICE activity includes like border patrol showing up at farms and asking farmers if they could tell us a wellness check on the children of the farm workers, and ask for their information. If there's not an actual, physical arrest happening, we still want to know about it. You can use the ICE tracker tool on our website.
And there is another population for which there isn't a rapid response, because we have something called expedited removal. And that is the ability to deport someone without any legal process, without any appeal, and it is permissible at the border. And yes, again, we're 100 miles from the border. So, and I have a different population. We all interact, but for example, for the spouses, for the people coming in to see their fiancés, I mean, I can tell you right now, we have a deportation at the border. They've expeditedly removed him. There's nothing that can be done. He's in the 2.5-year process waiting. His wife gave birth. He was coming in. They decided he came in too often, and they took his phone, and he didn't say that he was coming in to see his baby. They said he'd been here too long, expeditedly removed. And I see a lot of this. The problem is there's not a whole hell of a lot you can do. You can fight them. We used to be more successful, not that net, but there is an entire population of deportees. They're not being held in detention, but of our population that's either refused entry or denied and expedited at the border or within a population, and there's not a whole hell of a lot. I mean, I hate to say that, but I don't know if you guys have been successful in trying to overdo any expedited removals. It's tough.
Reopening or having any sort of review is almost impossible, because it's a summary deportation. But in that situation, there's the right, or there's supposed to be, to credible fear, or if previously deported, reasonable fear.
But if there's none of that, it's their decision that you were not truthful, and,
Exactly.
and you're done. And those are incredibly sad cases because it's what breaks up families and workers and things like that. I mean, I literally, not so long ago, someone coming in, a work-related thing for someone here in Vermont. And they decided he was applying for the wrong type of visa at the border. And he wasn't truthful, is what they said. Expeditedly removed. And, again, I can get...
And with an extra.
With an extra.
With a misrep.
With a misrep, right? Not only they get denied from coming in and expeditedly removed, but they're tagged with a fraud, a 6C fraud determination.
Oh my God.
That makes them permanently inadmissible. One of my favorite cases was right after, this is how old I am, 9/11, when everything shut down. And they were coming in and they went, all the airports were closed down, they came and tried to come in through the border, expedited removal, they have these waivers that they can come in, but they're married now and there's no grounds for a waiver. And then she'll never move here, certainly now. So there is also a population that affects, because we go across the border, we got a lot of people across the border, that this happens and you don't even see or hear about it. And a lot of the things that are going on now will make that more frequent.
Really quickly too, just on that point, I was also just working recently with somebody who was in this boat, expedited removal, and it says very clearly in the really, really BS, pardon my acronym, police report basically for this encounter that they have, that it makes very clear that they're using Google Translate to talk to this person, and it's very obvious that they didn't understand all of their rights, and it says very clearly for this person who's from Ukraine that they're not afraid to return to Ukraine. So it's just like that, and that's what you have to do in order to preserve your right to actually have one of these credible or reasonable fear screenings. And the Border Patrol officers are finding ways to kind of skirt that.
I agree, because I always look at the Q&A and there'll be something there, because after 7 hours of questioning, you'll say anything to get out of there. I mean, seriously. And I'll read, so you said that you were a barista when you really made Slurpees. And the next thing you know, you've got, so you lied about that. And as soon as I see, well, I said that, but I meant this, we're done. Because then I've got the fraud stuff and I can't, fight it, so.
That's awful. Thank you. I'm going to jump to some questions. Doug?
Two questions related to, it sounds like you've laid out many circumstances where someone in the immigration process's rights are very different from what we expect rights to be. So two questions. Does the normal attorney-client privilege that exists, does that exist when you're working with clients who are going through the immigration process? Is there any change or difference in that? And then the second question, relating to this 100-mile, many of us, probably most of us, live within 100 miles of the border, trying to get a better understanding of what powers the government has. Let's take me and a neighbor, and let's assume for the moment my neighbor is here with a green card. Can immigration officials come in, law enforcement officials come in to my house because I live within 100 miles? Can they come into my neighbor's house because they have an immigration status just because we live within 100 miles?
Do you want me to?
You want to go there?
Sure. So, great questions. I'm focused now on the 100-mile question, and I forgot your first.
The attorney-client privilege.
Oh, okay, privilege. Great. Generally speaking, yes, the ethical rules apply, whatever type of law you're practicing. In reality, poor people generally have a reduced expectation of privacy, and that's for any kind of civil legal service recipient, because strung out, under-resourced nonprofits are all just doing the best we can and trying to figure out how to collaborate and to make our limited services stretch to meet the needs of the overwhelming amount of people who are not going to really receive any meaningful help. And so we have things like coordinated entry and blanket releases of information. There are tools that we use to invite clients to sign away their privacy rights so that we can get together and coordinate services.
I I think might have been inexact with the way I phrased the question. I believe all of you will follow. Is there any moves by the government to try to violate the attorney-client privilege?
Well, yes. I mean, first of all, the White House issued an order saying that they're going to go after immigration lawyers. We don't know what they're going to do on some of that. I mean, with regard to attorney-client privilege, so for example, I know that if I'm going across the border, I can assert attorney-client privilege to prevent them from getting my phone. I've got to be smart and do it right away. And I will assert that privilege. So, I mean, it still exists as far as I'm concerned, so I don't think it's the breach of the privilege on that part. Although, I don't know what's going to happen if in fact this White House order, goes into effect. I mean, I haven't ever been in that position. God, don't jinx it now. No, I mean, seriously, I'm not sure, because again, if they were going to go and bring criminal charges, which is what they're alleging, I don't know that any of us have had to even look at how that would play out, sadly.
And I know I'm not the only one on this panel who's had a conversation with their wife about, like, what would happen if I got arrested? Let's have a plan. And that's a real, possibility. For me, I personally feel like I would rather normalize it because it's so antithetical to every core tenet of our democracy and rule of law that, like, if we're at a point where we're arresting lawyers for reading people their rights, like, we've got some real big problems that are bigger than, like, I don't want to spend time in a facility. So that's where I fall on that question, but I don't have kids, it's a different situation for me. On the question of the border, so remember that the border includes land or sea. So almost all of Vermont is within 100 miles of the border. And what the border jurisdiction means is not that there are no rights, no constitutional rights, and that Department of Homeland Security can carte blanche enter people's homes. What it means is they have jurisdiction to be conducting their business. When they are in charge of it, protecting the homeland and enforcing the Immigration Nationality Act, they can be doing that within 100 miles of the land or sea border, which encompasses most of Vermont. So when we mentioned before this possibility of setting up a routine traffic stop, I'm going to set up a stop and pull cars over in an allegedly non-discriminatory manner, and I'm going to just spot check people's immigration status, because most people don't know to assert their rights to silence, or they're afraid to because I have a gun and they don't. That's a Homeland Security law enforcement activity that can happen not just at Swanton, Vermont, but like deep into the interior of our state. Right? And so it can make something really routine, like going to Costco, really dangerous if you're brown. Because if you get pulled over and you get spot checked, to Leslie's point, you have two options. You can assert your right to silence, but if they think you're an immigrant or they discover you're an immigrant and you're not cooperating with the carry documentation requirement, they can detain you. If you show your documentation and they think that you are detainable, you're removable as charged, they can detain you anyway. It's tricky because it kind of, the border is leaking into the interior. The vast majority of the United States population nationally lives in the 100-mile border zone. All right, if you look at the whole border. But it doesn't, you still have, like, the bounds of law enforcement activity are still subject to the other constitutional rights that we have. So we have a constitutional right to enjoy privacy from unreasonable intrusion by government. Yes.
Unless you're different color.
Well, I was actually going to bring that up. This was not on our paper, but I think it's an important thing to reiterate that this is all very much based on appearance. And it's based...
When you take a situation, like a phone call, I can make myself heard. When my daughter called me, and I could sense tension in her voice, and my brown baby says, "Dad, I am afraid." Obviously born in the United States, obviously an American citizen, and she's calling her dad for a copy of her birth certificate because the car behind her just got profiled and stopped because the people behind her looked like her. That is freaking problematic. You know, and if you really want to cut to the chase, you know, that is another piece of what we're dealing with. And people just need to get real about it. You know, I mean, you know, there's all of these other nuances, but the reality is that. You know, so the bigotry, racism implications all fit. And then when you're given license to do what it will. So, anyways.
Yeah, and well, I mean, I'll just cop to it. I was pulled over twice last week. I am somebody who literally have a brown baby who's scared. Definitely. Especially as an adoptee whose paperwork's all funky. It's not great. It's really not great. And I think I'll just make this point. It's a real canary in the coal mine situation. And I know for all of my white allies that are here, it can be very comfortable and easy to think it's not going to come for you. But like we just heard, they may be going after lawyers. They don't seem to care about the ethnicity of a lawyer. I think to be very mindful, like they're calling into question birthright citizenship. It's a big thing. It's a big thing. So on that note, as allies, as people that also could be swept up in this if the winds start changing whatever they decide to do, you know, should we be carrying our papers? Are there things that we should be being mindful of to ensure that we're safe? I'm just gonna let that hang out there for a minute. Yeah,
I wouldn't let it hang out there. I'm advising my clients, sadly, people who are brown or newly naturalized and are going across the border
and not
to
just,
carry.
But I'm
this.
also just on that, when we talk, actually this is a great point, so when we talk about travel, right? If somebody wants to go to Canada, white, black, brown, whoever, how should we be moving? How should our travel plans change? What should we be carrying? You know, we have heard, are there particular phone numbers that we need to have with our phones? What do we need to have?
I mean, I always have thoughts, but I need to talk.
Sure thoughts. I mean, I am, go ahead.
Go ahead.
My question is,
Just speak
about
up, Carol.
phones. I read that you should not let your face open your phone, and that you should have it be only by punching in a code. If that's, I don't know if it's true, and number two, if it's true, are you required to tell your code to the person at the border?
You can decline. They can take your phone if you decline. I don't put a whole lot of, I mean, there are people, again, because they don't want it to wave across your face so that you can open your phone again, and there have been limitations as to what they can go into. For example, because it is a conduit, so in 2018, they limited, you can't go starting to search the web and all of that. However, in one of the recent directives that have come down again from the administration, is that they're looking at your postings. And I know now, like when I have to get a visa for someone, they're already Googling and all of that. I mean, you know, the days of privacy in that regard really are few and far between, because everybody's posting their dinner and everything else on Facebook, and we have to give them their passwords in order, if you want a visa to come in here, you gotta give them your passwords. So, you know, here, yes, you can say no. Probably if you're looking to come in, you might not come in if you're a citizen. You know, you can decline, you can try and decline, you can raise certain objections. Unfortunately, what happens most of the time is by the time that you raise those, the phone's gone. And that's reality. I mean, I don't know if you're finding that with your clients, but I am. We're fine over the border. If you disagree. with that.
Yeah.
So now moving forward, based on the recent events, if people have meetings with USCIS and they need to go to the office in Colchester, for example, how should they be operating now, doing that? Who should they be going with? What should they be bringing differently to be getting there safely, getting out of there safely?
Well, it depends. I mean, the answer to that, in my opinion, would be is who are they? Because you always have to look, and as Jill said, there's so many different and also statuses and things. In the past, and we hear stories from all over. Again, someone who was here perhaps out of status, and they're going for their biometrics, things like that. In the past, we didn't really worry about whether or not they would be detained. I'm not seeing that up here. There are possibilities if that could happen. Again, we're not seeing that, but technically they're not in status. So it's, it really depends. I would say the most vulnerable for something like that is if there's a criminal hit that comes up. I mean, I have not seen any detention just based on the fact that someone's out of, when I say out of status, and again, that doesn't mean you're a person who's here without authorization. It means someone who is not at the moment. There's a lot of people forget there's a lot of reasons people are out of status. Government makes a mistake. You don't get your stuff filed in time because you sent it to the wrong office. I mean, sometimes you look at it and you're like, oh my God, where the hell did we send this stuff? You send it 5 days later after your status expired. You are no longer eligible to get back in status in many situations. So now you've joined that group of undocumented. Could they be at risk? Yes. I mean, to some extent, manage some of the expectations or the fears, because at least I'm not seeing that up here. And is it happening one-offs around the country? Yes. I mean, Jill, I don't know if you guys are seeing that in your practices.
Seeing what?
People detained just were going up to USCIS.
Oh, yeah. No.
I think that's
Considering
not.
I was just black bagged going into his, supposedly his green card meeting recently at that office in Colchester.
You mean Mosin Medallion?
Yeah.
So, how should one approach that? Because that would be seemingly an innocuous meeting, but they were waiting outside, very heavily handed.
That was for a naturalization interview, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So, that was for a naturalization interview, and that kind of goes back to some of the questions that we do ask. What has been your activity? What are you posting? That right now it's shielded somewhat in anti-Semitism is what it's called, but if you look at the other part, it says anti-American. Still, to this day, my clients are going up and getting their fingerprints and going for naturalization, but again, there are certain things that maybe today, during this administration, are problematic. So I think whether, what someone's doing depends on who they are and what situation they're in.
Are there any safeguards that person can take going to Colchester, other than just doing the normal thing, walking in to your CIS interview?
With your
I think
documentation and
the
everything.
conversations that we're having around this right now are exactly what the administration wants us to be talking about. Because I think this is a pretty unique case. This was a high-profile arrest. It's a pretty unique case. And I think it's the same idea with this, the administration is trying to hit these, these numbers that they talked about for deportations or arrests or those sorts of things. The only way that they can do that is if people self-deport. This is the same thing. It's discouraging people. A high-profile arrest like this is making, honestly, all of my clients freaked out to go to. I had clients the next day that had biometrics appointments at the same office, and I had to tell them, it's going to be fine. And this is what, in my opinion, the administration wants to happen. They want to see people going back into the shadows and not exercising their rights to go to the biometrics to process their asylum application, their work permit application, their green cards. I can't pretend that I know every situation where somebody like Mosin Badawi is going to be arrested at their interview, But I think that, I mean, unfortunately, even he knew the risks going into that meeting, which is why his team of attorneys was prepared to file that habeas petition as soon as he was arrested. I think that that case is really extraordinary, completely unlawful. I was thrilled to hear the news that he got to walk out yesterday, but I think that it just pales in comparison to what we see day in, day out, and I personally have no issue currently telling my clients that they are safe to go to those appointments.
Just building on that, let's vary the hypo a little. I'm a lawyer, that's what we do. Today's May Day. A lot of people wanted to be out in community exercising their rights to assemble in support of economic justice and social justice. Right out here, as we were all walking in this evening, there were thousands of people assembled, right? And so I got a lot of questions from current clients or community partners asking me, can I be there? Can I appear? Can I go? Is it safe? Right? And to Brett's point, my personal approach is not to make recommendations of precautions. My approach is to empower people with the information that they need to make the best decisions for themselves. And I would lay out for my clients, just as Brett did, that was Mosen's case was an extraordinary case that was a really effective way of detaining one person and probably convincing thousands to self-deport out of fear. What a cost-effective way to achieve your goal, right? And I'll explain it to a client, like that was an outlier, and so is there a risk? Sure. How risk tolerant are you? What are the relative benefits of going on May Day to picket Hannaford and supporting Milk with Dignity with your comrades? Like, I don't know, you get to decide, right? And I might help you think through the costs and benefits. But what we know is a bunch of people got together today to picket Hannaford and there were no arrests, right? And so just like keep that in mind. I think to Brett's point, and this is the same thing about what I think about waiving your right to silence and volunteering your immigration status information to law enforcement, like it can't be incumbent on the most vulnerable, most directly impacted people in this country, immigrants and people of color, to keep our fundamental constitutional rights alive. They can't be the only ones maintaining silence with law enforcement, and the only people who are showing up for May Day, and the only people who are asserting their rights to due process. And so personally, my practice is never to be prescriptive with people about precautions.
Thank you for that. Elizabeth, you have a question?
I do. I'm going to expose my ignorance. Mohsen Madawi is from my area, and a lot of my constituents, including myself, are very upset about the events that took place. I don't really understand why 2 hearings. Why was he allowed out of prison now on his own recognizance and whatnot? Or he's on his own recognizance now, awaiting an immigration hearing, which is not in this jurisdiction. Can you explain that? Because I can't really get my head around it.
I need to start.
Mohsen's case is pretty unique. There's a few cases like this, high-profile cases that are going on in the country right now. The reason why he was able to walk out yesterday and the reason why he was able to stay in Vermont was because his attorneys quickly filed what's called a petition for writ of habeas corpus.
Right.
Basically asking for the court to find that his detention is unlawful.
Right.
But at the same time, his immigration process is still going. So the immigration court and the federal district court do not talk to each other. This one is still going. The question of the habeas case was just on detention. It's just a mechanism to get out of detention. Not everybody's at your run-of-the-mill like immigration arrest but let's say the most lawful immigration arrest you could ever think of, which is hard to imagine. That person is not going to have the same rights or ability to file the type of petition that Mosa Madawi did.
So that was really just to get out of jail.
Yes.
He was just getting out of jail and he's waiting someplace else for the same hearing that he would have had if he had been in jail. Is that
Correct. Yeah. And functionally, one of the good things about being able to keep him here in the Second Circuit is that the case law allows for judges, district court judges, to order immediate release if they find in favor of the petitioner. And not every jurisdiction is the same. And in fact, the Fifth Circuit is a jurisdiction that wouldn't necessarily allow the same sorts of rights, which is why the government wants to say, no, so, and would he have had the same rights to like have a bond hearing and those sorts of things in his immigration case? Yes, but this is a separate mechanism to sort of do that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
It's complicated.
Okay. Yeah. Peter, and then I'm going to jump us onto a different subject. Go ahead.
Maybe a less unique case is when the Trump administration or the government is taking away the protective status of folks from Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Haiti, including the two students at Champlain Valley. Sort of what happens to them if that removal of protection for a broad swath of people takes place? I know it's sort of blocked right now, but what sort of rights to appeal or hearing do those folks have when their status is just simply removed?
And you're talking about folks with temporary protected status, right?
I don't know if this is parole or protected status.
Or people who entered on
or
parole.
Or that entered on parole, okay.
So temporary protections, there are protections that arise in law passed by Congress, and if someone receives an immigration benefit that's under the law, there's a little more rigor to the process of taking it away. If you have an immigration benefit that comes from policy, meaning Congress delegated some authority to the president and was like, yeah, you can do what you want. And the president's like, cool, I'm giving parole to people from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. Right? Then the next president wants to change their policy and like, we're taking this away. Well, what happens to those people is that they become undocumented. But nothing else happens, right? What was so nefarious about the parole revocation process was that the notices that were sent out to Vermonters used very strong and incomplete language. Your parole is gone, you need to leave, don't try and stay, we will find you and deport you. It is true that being undocumented is a ground for to be charged with deportability. Just like being a national security threat, which is what Mosen's being charged with. He is a green card holder, but he's being charged with removability because he presents a threat to national security. But you're not in removal proceedings just because your parole was revoked. ICE would need to find you, prioritize you, serve you with a notice to appear, maybe detain you. Like, you're not actually being deported. You can't be deported by a letter. And those notices were sent out to inspire self-deportation, which is exactly what the two Nicaraguan students did. And once we were able to kind of connect, the legal community was able to connect with the school district and help these girls understand that they had other options. The statute provides all different kinds of pathways to regularize your status. They could have pursued a lot of different pathways. They decided that they didn't want to, and then they left. But for example, a lot of the people who I represent are now, any new filers, or a lot of people who were in parole or temporary protected status. They're at risk of losing those protections. And so now they're applying for some other pathway, usually asylum. And nothing happens. But the letters didn't make any mention of, you have a right to apply for other statuses, you could be charged with removability and put into a removal proceeding. No, the letter basically made a reader think, I've been deported.
And
and I agree, and that's a great clarification. The problem that exists is if they don't have, once you're out of status, there's not a whole lot that can be done in many situations. You know, if these people that have the ability to file, they have a valid asylum claim, or they make a certain change within a certain time while they're still in status. But once, like I'll get the calls from an employer, oh my God, this guy is terrific. They have been working, he's out of status, we want to hire him. It's no option, no option. And, you know, so it's, again, whether or not they're being removed, but the problem then happens, what else can they do, right? If they can't have asylum or they don't fit into that, a lot of times they're going to end up in that sea of undocumented, right? That we don't know where to go with them. There's not a whole lot of avenues. I think that's kind of one other scenario on that.
Thank you. So I'm going to move us into a different direction. I want to talk about our roles as legislators. And even though this is very much a federal issue, we kind of have our limits in what we're able to do. What can we do within those limits? Do you all have any thoughts about that? I think Jill has thoughts.
I do have thoughts.
Okay.
I'll preview for you all that this is beautifully curated on VAP's website, and so you can take a look after. There's a lot of opportunity in the state level to be protecting and maybe even advancing people's rights regardless of immigration status. There was a movement, a so-called movement for immigration new federalism, that came up in the last decade, this idea that states can be legal laboratories for the advancement of rights. And I don't need to say this in this House, because Vermont has been at the forefront of civil rights and constitutional rights advancement for the whole history of the United States, right? Vermont is a state that celebrates firsts, the first to abolish slavery, and to lift up the rights of women, and to create the access to exchanges of property and rights like I get to enjoy as a queer person. We were the first state to put out a COVID equity stimulus during the pandemic to make sure that immigration status wasn't a barrier to economic relief during the pandemic. So many firsts that we've celebrated here. And I was learning this week, we're the last state in the union to maintain our common benefits clause in our state constitution. What? There's so many opportunities here. We have not only the legacy, but the source of authority. And there is a lot of law that happens around it, immigration law, that is immigration sensitive. So a lot of laws that are on the books that decide whether or not a person has access to something like ID or a driver's license or health insurance or housing assistance, and all of those factors are governed not by the Immigration Nationality Act. Right? Immigration law decides who has the status, but we can all decide what the status means. What does it mean as you move through community life? And there's been an incredible movement in the State House this session to push forward a suite of immigration-sensitive bills that are focused on making sure that immigration status it doesn't have such a power over our community, that it's not so sensitive, that there are things about participating in our community that we want to make available to everyone. And I really appreciate it because I can only imagine what it's like to be making laws in this environment, because I myopically focus on immigration, but I am aware that there are other issues in the world. I hear. And I can't imagine what it's like to be in y'all's shoes and to not have, first of all, you don't have any office support, but like to be feeling the urgency, the emergency, not just from the immigration community, which is like where we get it, but you're getting it from every angle. And I do want to just take a moment to express thanks, because I recognize what a heroic effort it's been this session. But there's been incredible movement on a move to expand the state refugee office's jurisdiction to coordinate immigration services writ large, focusing not just on refugees as a subpopulation, but to coordinate services for all immigrants, all foreign-born Vermonters writ large. That's the Office of New Americans Bill, S56, which is proceeding to the House floor, very, very exciting. We also, we're really excited to see fair housing protections expanded at age 169. I practiced fair housing for a couple of years at Vermont Legal Aid, and I've heard so many stories about how many of our immigrant community members are able to pay full market rent and still not able to get a house because they get asked for social security number and experienced discrimination that they can't seek recourse from. There's been a lot of interesting movement at the state level to think about how much we want our public safety and public health systems entangled with Department of Homeland Security activities. How are we to convince community members that it's safe to go to the hospital when you need it, or to call 911 if you need protection, when in the back of your mind you're afraid that that's going to eventuate in an ICE enforcement action? There's a lot to say there, a lot of healthcare, a lot of great stuff in the State House, and I just thank you all, because the progress that you've all made in this House this session, as we watch the intractable immigration laws get worse than they already were, the way the immigration system's working, you've given us a lot of hope here in the State House about opportunities we still have available to us to see just results.
In the New Americans Act, like one of the things,
Massachusetts just set aside $5 million in funding for legal services for non-immigrants again, because Jill and, they're swamped, they're barely sleeping, can't even field the calls, and, if we can somehow find a way to have, an increase in funding for legal services, not just your detainees, but, your DACA kids, your other immigrants who are in need of these services that can't get them anywhere else, I think would be huge. One thing, and this is not necessarily our state, but where we go on a federal level, because this week the House introduced draft bills to fund agencies through this Homeland Security. It's going to impose higher fees on asylees. It's really going to be deadly. There's some things that really could use to be voted against on this particular act that's up there right now. That's not putting it in our, but I would say to kind of get that on the radar, because I think it would make a difference, and definitely the fair housing as well, because that would be a huge benefit here.
I'm hoping maybe at the very end, you could do things to remember, top things to remember. So I think what you were saying a little earlier about, kind of don't capitulate, the chances of being picked up are pretty slim. Things that we should all keep in mind at the end. That would be helpful to me.
Absolutely.
Can you explain due process? I'm beginning to think it's a range for all different types of people. It's not just having your day in court. Is that?
That's correct.
If you're on US soil, whether you're here legally or not legally, my understanding is you have a right to due process. And what happens there in a due process? Is it different for, let's say, myself, or for someone who's here illegally, or for someone who has status? All those due processes, is a different process?
I could just give a short answer and pass it to anyone else. I think there is a floor of minimum process due, depending on the type of proceeding, and depending on what's at stake, the posture of the person who is at risk of losing the thing that's at stake. And yes, some process is immigration sensitive. Generally speaking, there's a difference between what the law says, how much process is due, and what people actually experience. And that is very much based on race, on class, on language, on disability, and these different factors, protected aspects of people's identity. So there is, the law says that due process is blank, and different kinds of due process owed based on what's at stake and who the person is that's asking for protection. And then there's the reality of the huge justice gap. Like even in immigration law nationally, Black immigrants are exponentially less likely to have access to counsel. And that's true here in Vermont too. Because if I look at the statistics of how many people of color in Vermont, and then I do a race analysis of my caseload, I see that I am disparately underrepresenting immigrants, Black immigrants in particular. So like all of these different factors are kind of conspiring. But the point is, this concept of due process, the idea that there is a floor, is a really core tenet of our system of government, and it is under threat. And immigration processing is fertile ground to be experimenting with authoritarianism. And if due process slips away in the immigration setting, then it's at risk in every other setting too.
Does anybody else have any other questions? Will?
I'll add one takeaway
Okay.
to answer your question for legislators. Thank you all for being here. And at the risk, I guess, of maybe stating the obvious, whether you're an immigrant or a non-immigrant, you've got very similar needs for legal services. And so we've touched on many of them here. Some are directly related to immigrant status, but there are plenty of small business owners out there who have small business needs. And so there is this place called Vermont Law and Graduate School that has a whole host of clinics that offer these free civil legal services. One of them is a small business law center, which has a clinic associated with it. So same sort of model with our Center for Justice Reform Clinic, which is essentially an immigration clinic where we use faculty members who oversee students, and so we have this very capable student resource who can essentially practice law in the state of Vermont under the Vermont practice rule, so long as they're operating under the guidance of a faculty member who's admitted to the bar, like Brett is, for example. But that also applies to small business. It also applies to things like the South Royalton Legal Clinic, which assist veterans and their families. So I think someone at one point we touched on an immigrant who was married to a veteran. I mean, that would apply. So they could access legal services through the South Royalton Legal Clinic, or domestic violence victims, right? Or anything related to child custody or family law matters. So these are just some of the things that are available through the law school's clinical services. So
Thank you. Great, thank you. So Will had a question, then Peter?
Can everyone hear me? I don't have
Yeah.
that much lung capacity today.
It's okay.
There you go. So back home with some of my constituents that are college students that are here on visas, this is a very difficult time. And when I've gotten the question about what we're doing in Montpelier, really they ask that, but also what they ask is it safe to go out without documentation? Again, I'm not legal counsel or anything, but my general advice has been telling them I would take it out if you go. And then I have a group chat ready to go with all the international students because I talk to our police chief on the daily. And if he said that if any ICE agents contact him or the office, that he would let me know so that I could tell the college, because I know that there's some regulations around that in Vermont. So I just want to know so I'm better educated when I go back to them. One, should they be carrying documentation with them when they go outside of the college community? But then the second thing is I'm blanking on that second one. But that first one, if you could really help with that first one, that one would be great. Thank you. And then I have a follow-up question as well on 169 that I want to ask.
I think that we've kind of spoken about this quite a bit. Like I think as a general rule of thumb, having proof of status is your best bet. When and how will that help or benefit you is tough to say. And again, something that Jill had mentioned before, having those documents, I mean, you're talking specifically about students who are here on visas. I have no problem telling you that it's probably safest for those folks to have documentation of their status with them, period. But the fact remains is that if we start talking about precautions, like where do we draw the line? Because at a certain point, having those documents and turning them over is an invitation to pry deeper. So, but that being said, personally, I would say if you can have some proof that your F1 status is current, yes, do that.
Also, I would add to this, and I don't know for those of you that know, but what's happened recently with students is all of a sudden they were getting notices that they are, ICE oversees the student population. That happened after September 11th because they were here as students and they became, we started to focus in on students. And about a month ago, suddenly without notice, students were they were being dropped from the system. It's called the SEVIS system. And they were receiving notices that they got to get out, it's done, they've lost their visas are canceled. There have been, I can't even tell you how many successful lawsuits on this. It's just whether or not SEVIS is status or not status. They've turned around on that and now they're being reinstated. They said yesterday they're going to come back with a more robust system. One thing I do tell students is they are mining, for any kind of criminal activity. And, we know students that were dropped because an unpaid parking ticket ends up as a warrant. I mean, I remember when we were in college, it's like, yeah, we'll be out of here in 3 years. We'll let them pile up until you get your car booted, right? But now they are mining that. So, it's something to be aware of with students, just that if they have anything that doesn't make them removable or deportable, but they may end up, and I don't know what's coming with the new SEVIS, with the new SEVIS and what they're going to do with respect to that. They have announced that they're still in status because they are, but I don't know what's going to happen. It's hard because you go through, well, are we going to be talking about criminal issues and do we want to get into that? But it's something just to be aware of.
All right. We're running low on time.
Oh, yeah.
So
I'll ask my question after.
Okay, so we'll go to Peter and then, does somebody else have a question? Yeah. Okay, I'll take you after and then we'll do a top 5 wrap up.
Just curious, we talked a lot about sort of the problems in cases and taking away status, but what about sort of the run-of-the-mill immigration processes that go on? What can we expect from the Trump administration? I'm thinking about, we've got a lot of orchards that require workers with H-2A visas, the regular H-1B visa process, all of those processes. Do we expect a change in that?
Maybe. I can't say. I think that, if you believe the bluster that was going on ahead of the administration, I think even legal forms of immigration like that, in terms of what we're talking about is like employment-based immigration like that, is going to be disfavored or perhaps curtailed. As far as I know, I would hear about this. I don't think that it has been yet, but that's not to say that it won't happen in the future.
That's definitely something for us to be mindful of as growing and harvest season comes. You had a question, yeah?
Yeah, so this may be more of the fear mongering that they're trying to get us to fall for. But people who have a green card or permission to travel or in the process, is it no longer okay to leave the country and come back? Are you stuck? Is that dead or is that just kind of removed?
I get that question all the time. And what I say to people is, and this kind of goes to Jill's point, you are done nothing to violate your status, et cetera, Be prepared for additional questioning. It doesn't mean that you can't leave. Again, if someone has something criminal, then again, I would want them to have, evidence that it's not something that would keep them out. I mean, I don't think we can't keep people here, and people should be able to move freely, and for the most part, they are. But I do have, if people don't want to end up with additional questioning, that then they may want to not travel only because they don't want to deal with it. And
Some
I can't.
attorneys are saying, advising, do not leave the country.
Again, and I get that. And again, I mean, I have someone who, they were questioned by Border Patrol for a 4-hour stint, a few years ago. There's no way in hell they want to leave. They do not want to go through that again. Doesn't mean that they're going to be kept out, but I think that we can expect more questioning. Again, my clients many of them are going to go back and forth. Some I will, advise based on this and problems that you've had in the past. You may not want to. And it's not that you can't, it really depends on how risk averse. And risk averse is not just, half of this is fear, right? We're sitting here because we're talking because we're scared. And that's, for a lot of people, that's an anvil that's as frightening as, you can say nothing's ultimately going to happen other than you're going to have an extended dialogue. Yes, you don't know that nothing's going to happen. And I often say to many of my clients, if you don't want to deal with it right now, don't. But it depends on the person. Is there a blanket prohibition? No. For some there might be, depending on what's transpired when they're here, and that's why you kind of look at their background.
Okay, well, thank you all so much for this. This has been really wonderful and very
Other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the play?
Before we skedaddle, can we do a top 5 of what we need to be aware of, mindful of? What should we take away?
Go, Jill.
Go, Jill.
Bring it home.
I made a list.
Yes.
Key takeaway number 1, fear is the strategy. It will only work if we let it. Number 2, we have to be educating ourselves if we are in positions of leadership so that we can help educate others. If we are feeling this scared, imagine what the frontline staff are holding from the community members, the people who we supervise, who we're accountable to. We need to be educating ourselves. There's a lot of bad information out there, but there's also good information is available like never before. Number 3, rights are for everyone to protect and enjoy. These are some scripts that everyone should memorize. Am I being detained? I assert my right to remain silent. I assert my right to speak with an attorney. The motto is, don't concede, don't impede. Number 4, be a good witness. Rapid response calls, one more time, can be received at 802-881-7299. You can also report activities online. If you're a millennial and you don't like talking on the phone, at bit.ly, so bit.ly/report-migra-vt. It's also linked on my website. Number 5, www.vaapvt.org. The state has funded us to cultivate an educational website for you. Tell us what you need. Tell us what's missing. I'll add these top 5 to the blog. We're here for you.
You can get a
The last
newsletter.
4 digits of the phone number, because I have it down 2 different ways. Is it 7229 or 7299?
7229. Thank you for clarifying.
And then also, I'm just going to flag that the Vermont Law School and the Vermont Law and Graduate School also has a number of wonderful clinics. Please use them as a resource. We also pay for them too.
Yeah. And I'm just going to do a quick plug. Also, Jill does a newsletter And Migrant Justice has a running email list with calls to action, volunteering opportunities, something that we can just do as common citizens. But if anybody asks, if you're invited to a neighborhood potluck and everybody wants to know what can we do right now, is one of the things that we can do and that we should be doing is supporting the organizations that know that the best practices and that are carrying forward with a very universal understanding of everything that's actually going on the ground and federally and statewide, what the best actions there are to take, right? So I don't want to discourage somebody from bringing a hot plate. I mean, who am I to say no to a hot plate, or whatever, like bringing meals over to somebody who's sad. But we really do need to support the people that have the legal expertise that I don't have, and that are running networks of communication to report, to jump into action.
Yes, Rita.
And just where is the best place to donate? Would we legal aid to donate to?
I can take your pick. Anybody from this, any org from this panel,
and Migrant Justice,
and Migrant Justice, and then also anybody locally to your area that might be doing the work. Possibly reach out to Migrant Justice because they may know who is doing the work around the state.
I was also going to give a shout out to the Vermont Bar Foundation, who funds many of these organizations. And I'll also say that Hannah King, who's the executive director of the Vermont Bar Foundation, wrote an article for the Vermont Biz, I think, magazine is what it's called, back in March. And I'll quote her because it's sort of a nice one. Access to justice is not a luxury, it's a necessity. So they're doing good work as well, I think. So I was about to say this before you asked your question, but you asked your question, so that's another possible resource to donate to.
And then I also just will point you all to the resource table. Please take, Sean did such a great job printing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sean.
And and I just want to thank Sean and Peter and Leonora for all of the organizing work that you all did. You're the best.